Radio DJ Danny Torres had been entertaining the town for 3 years with music and morning banter. But when terrorists attacked the station and tore his shirt during the struggle, his communications specialist tattoos revealed he'd been quietly intercepting and decoding their secure transmissions all along. Welcome to Undercover Signals. Before we dive into this story of hidden frequencies, encrypted threats, and a voice that did more than entertain it, protected an entire community from those who communicated in the shadows. Tell me in the comments what country you're watching from today. And if you believe that the airwaves carry more than music for those trained to listen, hit that subscribe button. Danny Torres had been waking up Millfield with classic rock and terrible dad jokes for exactly 3 years. But the 15,000 residents who tuned into WMIL 96.7 FM every morning only knew him as the friendly voice who made their commutes bearable and their coffee taste better with a soundtrack of Led Zeppelin, AC, DC, and local news that actually mattered to people living in small-town America. At 34, Danny moved through the radio station with the methodical precision of someone whose understanding of communication systems, signal processing, and frequency analysis had been developed through experiences far more complex than queuing up the next track or reading weather reports to people heading to work at the grain elevator or county courthouse. WMIL occupied a converted warehouse on the outskirts of Millfield, equipped with broadcasting technology that appeared standard for a small market radio station, but which Danny had modified using expertise that went far beyond typical radio engineering or communications training. His adjustments to the station's equipment reflected capabilities that seemed sophisticated for a rural broadcaster, serving a community where the biggest news was usually high school football scores or county fair planning. What the listeners didn't know was that Danny's expertise in communications technology and signal analysis had been developed during 12 years as an Air Force communications specialist, serving with units whose missions required him to intercept, decode, and analyze enemy communications that determined whether American forces would have advance warning of attacks or would be caught unprepared by enemies who used sophisticated encryption and transmission techniques. Danny's transition from military communications to civilian radio had been motivated by PTSD symptoms that made continued signals intelligence work psychologically impossible, but which allowed him to use his technical skills in peaceful environments that provided structure and community connection without the psychological triggers associated with military operations, where intercepted communications revealed planned attacks on American personnel. His military communications training had included extensive education in signals, intelligence, encryption methods, and enemy communication patterns that allowed him to identify threats before they developed into active dangers. His expertise in radio frequency analysis, digital signal processing, and communication intercepts had been tested during assignments where American lives depended on his ability to decode enemy transmissions and predict their operational intentions. The Air Force communications specialist tattoos that documented Danny's military service remained hidden beneath long sleeves and radio station polo shirts that concealed evidence of 12 years spent monitoring enemy frequencies and decoding transmissions that revealed terrorist plans, enemy troop movements, and threats to American forces operating in hostile territory around the world. Danny's success as a radio DJ had been built on his natural personality and communication skills, but his technical management of the station's equipment and his understanding of broadcasting technology reflected training that exceeded typical radio engineering education. His ability to maintain clear signals and optimal sound quality drew on expertise developed through military communications, where signal clarity could mean the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. But Danny's most significant qualification was his continued ability to monitor and analyze radio communications that indicated potential threats to community safety or national security interests. His military training had taught him to maintain awareness of communication patterns that might indicate hostile activities, even during periods of apparent peace. This expertise had proven valuable for managing radio station operations and community emergency communications, but it also provided Danny with capabilities for detecting and tracking communications that indicated potential threats that conventional law enforcement wouldn't recognize or be qualified to investigate. Danny's monitoring of regional radio traffic and communication patterns had revealed increasing activity on frequencies that weren't allocated for civilian use, transmissions that used encryption methods and operational protocols that suggested coordination among individuals whose communications exceeded typical civilian or commercial radio usage. More concerning was Danny's recognition that the communications he was intercepting followed patterns that he had encountered during military service involving terrorist organizations and their methods for coordinating attacks while avoiding detection by conventional monitoring systems that focused on standard communication channels. His analysis of the intercepted communications indicated that a terrorist cell was operating in the region, using sophisticated radio equipment and encryption techniques to coordinate activities that posed genuine threats to local communities and potentially to regional infrastructure or military installations. His attempts to alert federal authorities to the terrorist communications had been complicated by his reluctance to reveal the military background that qualified him to assess enemy communication activities, and by civilian officials' lack of understanding regarding how terrorist organizations could operate through rural American communities while coordinating attacks through encrypted radio transmissions. The morning of January 15th began with Danny conducting his routine broadcast while simultaneously monitoring regional radio frequencies using equipment that he had integrated with the station's systems to provide comprehensive signals intelligence coverage of the area surrounding Millfield. His analysis of overnight communication intercepts had revealed that the terrorist cell was approaching the final phases of operational planning for attacks that could target regional infrastructure or population centers with the kind of coordination that indicated extensive preparation and sophisticated operational capabilities. At 8:23 a.m., during a commercial break between weather and traffic reports, Danny's monitoring equipment detected encrypted transmissions that included specific references to timing, target selection, and resource allocation that indicated the terrorist cell was implementing final preparations for attacks that could occur within hours, rather than the days or weeks that would be required for federal authorities to investigate and respond to his reports. Danny realized that his community was facing immediate threats from terrorist operations that conventional law enforcement couldn't detect or counter, and that his unique combination of radio station access and military communications training positioned him as the only person capable of gathering the intelligence necessary to prevent attacks that could result in significant casualties among people who trusted him to provide them with music and information that made their daily lives more enjoyable. The terrorist communications that Danny intercepted revealed a level of operational sophistication that exceeded anything he had encountered during his military service, utilizing encryption methods and coordination techniques that indicated extensive training and resources that suggested state sponsorship or support from international terrorist organizations. The cell's leader, identified through communication analysis as Imam Hassan al-Zawahiri, was coordinating simultaneous attacks on multiple targets throughout the Midwest, using encrypted radio networks to maintain operational security, while directing resources and personnel whose capabilities exceeded typical domestic terrorist organizations. Danny's signals intelligence training allowed him to recognize that al-Zawahiri's communications included references to chemical weapons, coordinated timing, and casualty maximization that indicated the planned attacks were designed to cause mass casualties while creating psychological terror that would demonstrate American vulnerability to asymmetric warfare conducted by enemies operating within domestic territory. Their use of sophisticated encryption and frequency hopping techniques reflected professional military training and access to equipment that conventional terrorist organizations couldn't obtain through typical criminal channels, suggesting coordination with foreign intelligence services or professional terrorist networks that possessed advanced technical capabilities. Danny's systematic decoding of the intercepted communications had revealed that the terrorist cell was preparing to release chemical weapons in multiple population centers simultaneously, creating a coordinated attack that would overwhelm regional emergency response capabilities while causing casualties that could number in the thousands. But Danny's investigation had also revealed that the terrorist communications included specific references to monitoring local radio transmissions and emergency response frequencies, indicating that they were aware of potential interference with their operations and were prepared to eliminate threats to their operational security. His decision to take direct action against the terrorist cell would require him to abandon the anonymity that had allowed him to heal from military service trauma while exposing capabilities that he had kept hidden throughout his civilian employment. But the threat to innocent lives required him to prioritize community protection over personal security. Danny's approach to disrupting the terrorist operations utilized both his radio station access and his military communications training to interfere with their coordination while gathering evidence that could provide federal authorities with actionable intelligence about their plans, personnel, and operational capabilities. The confrontation that would expose Danny's military background occurred when his interference with terrorist communications was detected by operatives whose training had taught them to recognize when their encrypted transmissions were being monitored and decoded by individuals with professional signals intelligence capabilities. Al-Zawahiri's response to discovering Danny's communication intercepts indicated both his operational competence and his recognition that the radio station represented a threat to operational security that required immediate elimination to prevent compromise of the coordinated attacks. The radio station has been monitoring our communications, Al-Zawahiri transmitted to his operatives during an encrypted conversation that Danny intercepted in real time. Eliminate the threat immediately and destroy any equipment that could compromise our operations. Danny understood that the terrorist cell was preparing to attack the radio station while he was conducting his morning broadcast, creating a situation where his survival and the prevention of mass casualty attacks would depend on his ability to utilize both his communications expertise and any combat capabilities that he had retained from military service. His preparation for the terrorist assault involved activating emergency broadcast protocols while implementing communication jamming techniques that would disrupt the terrorists' coordination capabilities during their attack on the station. His approach drew on military communications training that had been designed for exactly this type of scenario, where American communications personnel faced direct assault by enemies whose operational success depended on eliminating signals intelligence capabilities. The attack on WMIL began at 9:47 a.m. as Danny was introducing the morning classic rock block, with Al-Zawahiri's operatives approaching the station using tactics that reflected professional military training and equipment that exceeded typical terrorist capabilities. Danny's response to the terrorist assault drew on both his military communications training and his understanding of the radio station's equipment and layout to create defensive advantages while maintaining the emergency broadcasts that could warn local communities about the developing threat. The revelation of Danny's military background occurred during the terrorist assault, when Al-Zawahiri personally entered the broadcast studio to eliminate Danny while he was transmitting emergency warnings, creating a direct confrontation that would test both his communications expertise and his survival capabilities against an enemy whose operational experience exceeded typical domestic threats. The assault on the radio station's broadcast studio occurred at 9:51 a.m. as Danny was transmitting emergency warnings about the terrorist threats, while simultaneously jamming the cell's communication frequencies to disrupt their coordination during what his intercepted intelligence indicated were final preparations for chemical weapons attacks on multiple regional targets. Al-Zawahiri entered the studio with professional composure that reflected extensive experience in elimination operations, but his approach also revealed his lack of understanding regarding the technical capabilities that Danny possessed through his military communications training and his modifications to the radio station's equipment. "You have interfered with our operations for the last time, American," Al-Zawahiri said as he prepared to eliminate Danny while the emergency broadcast continued. "Your monitoring of our communications ends now." Danny's response drew on 12 years of signals, intelligence training, and his understanding of how to utilize communications equipment for purposes beyond conventional broadcasting. "Imam, I've been monitoring your network for 3 months. Federal authorities already have everything they need to stop your attacks." The confrontation between Danny and Al-Zawahiri occurred in an environment where both men's technical expertise was tested against their opponent's capabilities, with Danny's communications training providing him with advantages that the terrorist leader couldn't anticipate or counter through conventional assault techniques. Al-Zawahiri's attempt to destroy the radio station's equipment while eliminating Danny created tactical complications that allowed Danny to utilize his military training while protecting the broadcast capabilities that were providing regional emergency services with real-time intelligence about terrorist activities and coordination. The physical struggle between them resulted in damage to studio equipment that included the electrical systems Danny had modified for signals, intelligence purposes, creating sparks and equipment failures that ignited studio materials while exposing both men to electrical hazards that tested their survival capabilities. The accident that revealed Danny's military identity occurred when Al-Zawahiri's assault on the broadcast equipment created electrical fires that ignited Danny's radio station polo shirt, forcing him to remove the burning clothing that had concealed the Air Force Communications Specialist tattoos documenting his military service. The exposure of his tattoos provided immediate confirmation to al-Zawahiri that his operational security had been compromised by a former military communications specialist whose training and experience qualified him to intercept, decode, and analyze the terrorist cell's encrypted transmissions with capabilities that exceeded anything the terrorist leader had anticipated. Communications specialist al-Zawahiri observed as he reassessed the threat that Danny represented to his operations. Air Force Signals Intelligence. That explains your technical capabilities and your interference with our network. Danny's response reflected 12 years of communications training and his understanding that his survival and the prevention of mass casualty attacks required him to utilize every aspect of his technical and operational capabilities. I've decoded every transmission your cell has made for 3 months. I know your targets, your timing, and your operational structure. The battle that followed tested Danny's military training against al-Zawahiri's operational experience in a confrontation that combined technical warfare with physical combat, as both men attempted to control access to communications equipment that could either enable or prevent the coordinated terrorist attacks. Danny's superior knowledge of the radio station's equipment and his communications training provided him with tactical advantages that offset al-Zawahiri's combat experience and weapons capabilities. While his emergency broadcasts continued providing federal authorities with real-time intelligence about the terrorist threats, the engagement was decided by Danny's ability to use his communications expertise to coordinate with federal tactical units while simultaneously jamming the terrorist cell's coordination frequencies, creating conditions where their operational capabilities were compromised while law enforcement resources could respond to prevent the chemical weapons attacks. Al-Zawahiri's defeat occurred when Danny's technical manipulation of the radio station's transmission equipment created communication disruptions that prevented the terrorist cell from coordinating their attacks while providing federal authorities with precise locations and operational intelligence that enabled comprehensive tactical response. The neutralization of al-Zawahiri provided federal agencies with access to intelligence about international terrorist coordination, chemical weapons procurement, and operational planning that would be invaluable for preventing similar attacks throughout the American Midwest and other regions where terrorist cells might be conducting comparable operations. The federal response to Danny's intelligence about the terrorist chemical weapons plot revealed the scope of the coordinated attacks that had been prevented through his interception and decoding of encrypted communications that conventional law enforcement monitoring systems couldn't detect or analyze. Investigation into al-Zawahiri's terrorist network exposed connections to international organizations that had been planning simultaneous chemical weapons attacks on American population centers, with the Millfield operation serving as a coordination hub for activities throughout the Midwest that could have resulted in thousands of casualties if their operational timeline had been completed. Danny's communications intercepts had provided federal agencies with comprehensive intelligence about terrorist operational methods, encryption techniques, and coordination protocols that would be critical for identifying and preventing similar attacks in other regions where terrorist cells might be using comparable communication systems. Federal agencies offered Danny positions in signals, intelligence, and counterterrorism communications that would utilize his expertise while providing him with official recognition for capabilities that had been crucial for preventing mass casualty attacks on American communities. But Danny's decision reflected his commitment to Millfield and his belief that protecting small communities from terrorist threats required individuals with appropriate military training positioned where they could recognize and counter communications that indicated hostile activities that conventional monitoring couldn't detect. The Air Force Communications Specialist tattoos that had been hidden for 3 years became symbols of Danny's continued service to American security interests, while representing his evolution from military signals analyst to civilian broadcaster whose protection of community airwaves included defending against threats that most radio personnel would never recognize. Danny's appointment as Regional Communications Security Coordinator for rural radio stations allowed him to continue his broadcasting career while providing expertise for protecting American communication systems from exploitation by terrorist organizations whose operations posed threats to both local communities and national security. The military communications training that Danny had received for intercepting and analyzing enemy transmissions was expanded to include instruction for other radio personnel and emergency services in recognizing and reporting suspicious communications that might indicate terrorist activities, conducted through encrypted radio networks. For Danny personally, the most significant outcome was the integration of his military communications identity with his civilian broadcasting career, creating a professional role that honored both his technical training and his commitment to protecting community communications from those who would exploit radio frequencies for hostile purposes. The radio station that had provided Danny with refuge from military service trauma became the headquarters for communications security operations that protected American communities from terrorist exploitation of radio systems that conventional security measures couldn't monitor or control effectively. Danny's development of communication monitoring protocols for rural broadcasting became a model for protecting community radio systems from exploitation by terrorist organizations, whose operations posed threats that conventional monitoring systems weren't designed to detect or counter. The recognition of Danny's heroism in preventing the chemical weapons attacks brought national attention to the vulnerability of American communication systems to terrorist exploitation, and the critical importance of having personnel with appropriate military training positioned to recognize and counter such threats. Congressional hearings on domestic communications security featured Danny's testimony about the need for integrating military communications expertise with civilian broadcasting systems to create comprehensive protection against terrorist operations that used radio frequencies for coordination and operational planning. Danny's story became a case study in the value of utilizing military veterans whose specialized training could be applied to civilian security challenges that required capabilities beyond typical law enforcement or communications industry expertise. The Millfield terrorist plot was recognized as a representative example of how terrorist organizations could operate through American communities while using sophisticated communications to coordinate attacks, leading to enhanced monitoring protocols for radio communications and improved coordination between federal agencies and civilian broadcasters. Danny's appointment as Director of Regional Communications Intelligence for the Midwest Broadcasting Network allowed him to continue his radio career while providing expertise for protecting American communication systems from terrorist exploitation that posed threats to both local, communities, and national security. The military communications training that had been developed for signals intelligence operations in overseas locations was adapted for domestic applications that could protect American communities from terrorist communications activities conducted through exploitation of civilian radio frequencies and broadcasting systems. Danny's development of threat detection systems for civilian communications became the foundation for national security programs that acknowledged the critical importance of protecting American broadcast systems from terrorist operations that most communications professionals weren't trained to recognize or counter. For Danny personally, the most significant outcome was the validation that his military communications training retained critical importance for protecting American communities from terrorist threats, and that his transition from military to civilian service had prepared him for exactly the kind of challenge that tested both his technical expertise and his commitment to protecting innocent people. The small-town radio station that had provided Danny with peaceful employment became the headquarters for communications intelligence operations that protected American communities from terrorist exploitation of broadcasting systems that most security professionals wouldn't recognize as potential tools for hostile coordination and operational planning. Danny's morning show continued to entertain Millfield with classic rock and terrible jokes, but his listeners now knew that their favorite DJ was also the guardian whose technical expertise protected their community from threats that traveled through frequencies most people would never think to monitor. Have you ever encountered someone whose technical knowledge seemed to exceed their apparent profession? Someone whose understanding of communications or electronics suggested training that went beyond civilian education? Share their story in the comments. Tell us about the technical experts who've crossed your path, the radio operators whose skills seemed military trained, the communications specialists whose expertise appeared intelligence tested, the broadcasters who prove that the airwaves carry more than entertainment for those trained to listen. At Undercover Signals, we believe that the most effective guardians are often those who've learned to hear what others miss, and whose technical expertise serves as both shield and weapon against those who would use our own communication systems for hostile purposes. Thank you for watching. If this story moved you, hit that subscribe button and help us honor the Danny Torres of the world, the communications warriors whose expertise in intercepting threats becomes their greatest tool in protecting the communities that tune in every morning, expecting nothing more than music and weather, never knowing their favorite voice is also their silent protector.